from my heart to your heart, our hearts together, we perform. One mountain has to be a performance, but not inauthentic, right? And in other words, right, all great art is performance, and life is great art, right? Life's great art, and it requires performance, right? We're always on, right? We're always on. It's the most beautiful thing in the world. Even when we're relaxing, we're totally spatially relaxing. We're actually, right? We're witnessed, right? Our story is fabricating, right? The world story. I want to, with permission, open in a little bit of an unusual way. And I'm a little hesitant because I'll tell you a story, which will tell you why I'm a little hesitant. So there's a story about a master who passes away, and there's this argument of who the inheritor of the lineage will be. And there's two competing masters who each think that they are worthy and appropriate to inherit this lineage. And so one of the two masters, the two young masters, has a dream, and he says to the other master, you know, our teacher came to me in a dream, and he said that I'm the successor. And of course, you know, the other competing master said, you know, when he comes to me in a dream and tells me that, then we'll believe him, right? And so I don't generally share, you know, my own inner landscape of, you know, kind of communications that come from the empiricism of worlds that are not readily accessible in this world, right? Meaning I don't generally share my own interior kind of mystical experience, in part because of that story, right? And, you know, in part because it's insufficient basis, right, to establish a new story of value. We have to establish a new story of value based on the intrinsic first principles and first values. We want to access a story that's not dependent on any person's first person. Does everyone get that? In other words, I want a story, we want a story. In the Renaissance, they wanted a story in that time between worlds that was the Renaissance, that wasn't based on one person's first person experience. As important as that is, those experiences are very important, but it actually, there was an understanding that the story that we tell has to be a story we can all access, we can all understand, right? Its principles come from multiple places. They come from physics and they come from the interior sciences, but we can access that story, we can live that story, we can feel that story. And for that reason, you know, I don't generally share my own experience. And the second reason I don't share my own experience is because I shy away from those experiences. Does everyone get that? You know, I shy away from those experiences. In other words, I happen to, just to share personally, I love to pray. I just love to pray, right? To just be in direct, intimate communion with what we call in cosmologic humanism, the name we've used to kind of call to God, to call to the field of value and to its personal face, is the infinite intimate. And one of the reasons I pray less than I enjoy praying, because I love to pray so much, right? And I could just spend the day praying, you know, and chanting and be perfectly happy. So I have a tendency towards mystical experience that I've tried to curtail because it feels actually not helpful, right? In other words, it's also easy to get lost in our own mystical experience. So I want to try and articulate a story of value that we can, as Da Vinci together, we can all be Da Vinci together. We can do the deep work, across the sciences, interior sciences and exterior sciences, and we can articulate the story of value. Does that make sense, everyone? But every once in a while, what happens is, and I just wanted to share this with you, every once in a while, the gates open so dramatically. And when I say dramatically, the gates are, and I want to try and be just, and this is just a little intimate beginning conversation. And then we'll go into, we have a huge day. I mean, an insanely exciting day, an insanely important day in terms of telling the new story of value in response to the meta crisis, which is what One Mountain's about. As we understand there's a meta crisis, we understand that it's real, and we understand that only a new story, only the emergence of a new human and a new humanity, only the evolutionary impulse moving in us, generating, right, the next stage, right, of what it means to be a human being, where we move from Homo sapien to Homo amor, where I can actually feel the whole and I'm in a relationship to the whole, where I understand that my transformation is the transformation of the whole. I act for the whole. My circle of intimacy expands. Only such a story out of which we generate a new reality can actually respond effectively to the meta crisis, that actually top-down infrastructure solutions, as valuable as they may be, or social structure solutions, new regulations, are insufficient, the meta crisis will win. That actually we need to change the very fabric of reality, which is the story that we live in. And only by evolving that story, which is to evolve the source code of consciousness and culture, which is the evolution of the story, right, which is the inescapable framework from which we generate a new reality, only that can actually evolve the source code. That's our framework. And so in that framework, first person matters enormously. Right? It matters. The first person experience matters. But actually, it's got to be ultimately, right, a second person experience. We, as a community, we can all understand this together, and we can actually see the Dharma. We can see the first principles and first values. We see the coherence of the story. And in some sense, pre-modern religion was based on, to a large extent, one teacher claiming an experience, which was often true, sometimes not true, but claiming a direct experience and then sharing that experience. And that's legitimate, that's important, right? Buddha has his place, and Moses has his place, and Lao Tzu, right, has his place, right? But and Ibn Arabi has his place. But in the end, we need to move to a place where we can actually participate together. We can actually receive the deepest transmission that we can from first person realizers. Does everyone get that sentence? First person realizer. Everyone got that phrase? It's a good phrase. Maybe we can jot it in the chat box, right? We need information from first person realizers. And yet we need information that we can access and check in ourselves and find its depth and find its goodness and find its beauty. Does everyone get that? We can't rely on a first person realizer. We have to be able to then find some fragrance of that realization that lives in me. I've got to hear that realization and then recognize it. And then, although I may not get myself to the fullness of that realization, but I can access something of it, right? I can actually, right? It actually resonates in me. I've got to find my resonance with that. The word resonance, everyone get that word? Resonance is a good word. I've got to resonate. And then I've got to look for my own realization, right? I've got to become a first person realizer myself. That's why we've talked about for the last 15 years, the democratization of enlightenment. That we actually have to all become realizers. We have to all become artists. We have to all become Homo amor. We can't rely on the hero. We've talked about the democratization of the hero, which is in essence the democratization of Homo amor, which is in essence the democratization of enlightenment. Okay, so that's all. That's all an apology, right? That's all an apology for what I'm going to say now. Okay, that was all. This was a long apology for just sharing a first person moment. But does everyone get why this apology matters? Right, meaning we're not basing ourselves on first person realizing, right? But every once in a while, it seems important to share. Does everyone get that? Who's got a yes on why we did this big introduction? Does everyone get that? So I don't want to I don't want to misunderstand that we're shifting to an authority of first-person realization. We're not. And yet first-person realization is part of the story. It's an important part of the story. So for some reason, I have a suspicion of why, but I'm not going to bore you with my suspicions. But for some reason, the last 2 weeks, the gates were very open, right? In other words, the membrane between worlds in my own life was very open. And I had a number of very, very kind of intense visitations. And I want to be precise. I don't want to call them dreams. They actually weren't dreams. And as in my own practice, I'm able to distinguish between a dream and a kind of visitation. These were more like visitations. You know, I had the first one when I was 16 and my teacher who died, right? You know, I had a kind of very direct and very powerful experience with him. And so the last 2 weeks, you know, I've had like 3 or 4 visitations and I haven't had any for a couple of years, right? I haven't had any for a couple of years. So it was like a very intense, right, experience. And again, I apologize again for sharing this, but I feel like, you know, this is not the kind of topic we talk about, but it's important to know that it's real, that it's important, and that we need to listen to it. And essentially, you know, this morning, right, the voice in the visitation was a student of mine whose name I won't mention. He's a very well-known professor today. He's someone who started studying with me when he was 14 or 15. And we parted ways at some point, you know, in 2006. He's deep in the kind of Orthodox Jewish world at this moment. He's an excellent professor and an excellent, you know, thinker in multiple ways. And he appeared in this dream speaking for a whole currency of spirit, taking issue with 4 big pieces in the story of value, which is cosmorotic humanism. And I responded, right, in the dream to the 4 pieces, right? And, you know, and I shared it with Zach, with KK, and we clarified, you know, some of the pieces kind of very early in the morning. And I sent to Jacqueline probably 15 voxes about that clarification. And I have to just share that I was ecstatic and filled with the gravitas of responsibility, right? Filled with the gravitas of responsibility, right? Meaning, I am sure, my friends, that we've made mistakes. I'm sure we've made mistakes here, right? We are, you know, we're all imperfect vessels for the light. But I think I can, with tears in my eyes, tell you, we are making mistakes in the right direction, right? That what we're doing here every week in One Mountain, right? And what we're doing here in coming together to tell this new story of value and to download it into the source code of consciousness and culture, right? As, right, the next great movement of She, right? The next turning of the wheel. That our actual understanding that, you know, we are here, you know, in One Mountain, someplace in Florence, right, in the Renaissance, and it is a time between worlds and a time between stories, literally. And that the only way to respond to the intensity of the existential risk and the catastrophic risk is to tell this new story of value. You know, I've mentioned before Nick Bostrom. Everyone know that name? Nick Bostrom. Nick Bostrom was the person who coined the term existential risk. He wrote a very, very important book called Superintelligence. And he just wrote a new book. And Lena, this is for you. And the book was utter insanity. It was rubbish. And it was bad, right? In other words, it was really just, it was pretended to be philosophy, but it was trite, right? It was just, I was embarrassed by the book, right? Zach was reading it. He turned me to it. You know, we're going to respond to it in our book, Techno-Feudalism, right? And I have huge respect for Nick Bostrom. He did incredibly important work at the Oxford Center for Existential Risk. But in other words, he literally couldn't find his way to a new story because in the end, for Nick is a subtle materialist and values ultimately not real. And so he ran into kind of the value uploading problem. How do you actually engage the planetary stack and invest it with value when value itself is not real? And he literally couldn't get to this realization that reality is actually stories, and that stories are the ontology of reality, and that stories are stories of value, and that reality itself yearns for value, and that value is real. And the reason he couldn't get there is because he was mired, M-I-R-E-D, mired, stuck in, the critique of value that swept the academy, which he took as a given. And I'm not going to go down that road now, right? But in other words, my point is, right, and Lane, you got it right. Bostrom hit the wall, right? That's exactly right, right? He hit the wall. And sometimes Zach and I split books. He reads some and I read some. And he said, hey, Mark, I got this book. You don't need to read it, but I went and did anyways. And it's just, I was just kind of shocked. And I was shocked not by how bad the book was, right? But by the beauty of Bostrom's soul, who's just kind of desperately reaching for something and just couldn't find his way. And I just had this intense realization of just the intense coherence and resonance and subtlety and accuracy of the story that we're telling, which is evolving, right? It's evolving, right? And as every week, the story clarifies more and more. And we come together and we try and clarify another piece and another piece and another piece, and we speak it, and then it gets, re-artistically kind of laid out on the canvas of Elena, and then it gets recapitulated, by Christina, and gets resonated by David, and that we all share it, and we all kind of, exchange with each other over it, and it gets, formulated, and then it's going to get, it's going to find its way into volumes and into articles, and ultimately we've got to deliver it into culture. But it's like I was just overwhelmed by, right? And so in the dream, last night, or actually early this morning, right, I had this exchange, if you will, with, we would call it in the lineage, Magidim, M-A-G-G-I-D-I-M, Magids, right? In other words, kind of voices in the subtle world who kind of were objecting to 4 dimensions of the Dharma, very specific dimensions, 4 specific dimensions. And if we were here in the evening and we were just talking, I'd spend the evening talking with you about this with great delight. And I responded to all 4 dimensions, and the responses were received. I mean, they were well received, right? You could feel them being well received on high, right? And so I want to, we'll talk more about that at a different time, but I just wanted to share with you, right, just in a very just a confessional moment, right, that these, right, that these, right, I mean, unbelievable, right, that these conversations, these dimensions, these, right, they're not just recorded on high, but, and it's hard for me to say this without breaking out crying, but I can feel directly, and I know many of you can as well, right, that the membrane between the wider field and between this world that lives in one mountain is thin, and that we're in the right direction, right? So it's a big deal. So yes, okay, so I just want to kind of hold that. Okay. Let's go part 2, okay? Let's go part 2, right? Well, let's go part 2. And so David, resonated code, my friend. Give us a code, okay? Oh my God.
Code coming at you.
Code coming at us.
I would love to just talk mystical experiences one day. We all share a mystical experience, because I feel like the Dharma actually opens up possibilities of kinds of mystical experiences that we wouldn't otherwise have. So
yes.
Just be fascinating. I know that's true for me. Okay, here is the evolutionary love code today. It brings a previous code to the next level and focuses on performing. What is performing our story here? So it's all about story. So here is the code. The universe is not a fact, or is not merely a fact. It is a story. Not an ordinary story, a love story. Not an ordinary love story, but an evolutionary love story. And your love story, my love story, is a chapter in the evolutionary love story. To know my life is a story is to know that the story must be performed. There are 3 levels of relationship to performance, and particularly to the performance of our story. Level 1, pre-tragic performance. Level 2 is when we meet the tragic and stop performing. Level 3 is the post-tragic, in which we reclaim both the dignity and divinity of our performance. So this week's Evolutionary Love Code: the universe is not merely a fact, it is a story. Not an ordinary story, a love story. Not an ordinary love story, but an evolutionary love story. And your love story is a chapter in the evolutionary love story. To know my life is a story is to know that the story must be performed. There are 3 levels of relationship to performance, and particularly to the performance of our story. Level 1, pre-tragic performance. Level 2 is when we meet the tragic and stop performing. And level 3 is the post-tragic, in which we reclaim both the dignity and the divinity of our performance. And with that, I turn my word back to you, Dr. Marc.
Thank you, David. Thank you. And we're gonna step in. Thank you so much, David. And we're gonna step into this now. And I'm gonna perhaps add one more word on first-person mystical experience, and why I don't casually, David, bring together a group to share mystical experiences, right? Because it just, right, everyone just kind of, it's very, the New Age has trivialized mystical experiences, in some real way, and it's lost the access to distinguish, right? And Sally Kempton and Sally was kind of a connoisseur of mystical experiences in some way, but in other words, there's kind of 2 movements that need to be made. On the one hand, we need to actually democratize and realize that actually everyone has access to interior experience, to interior mystical experience of some way. And that's what David was pointing to. And that's, of course, true. Prayer is a mystical experience, right? On the other hand, there's actually a great rigor in interpreting my own experience, right? In other words, precisely, for example, what Zen Buddhism was about the deep rigor of understanding, right, what experience is valuable and actually gives you, if you will, information and realization, and what's not. And so if you would go to your Zen master and you saw these kind of dramatic, kind of wild, kind of visual, colorful, ecstatic, he would say, sit on the cushion, or she would say, right? In other words, there was this kind of, right, the same thing with the schools of prophecy, right? The ancient schools of prophecy, right, in the ancient world were very rigorous about mystical experiences. And so I've tried to, over the last 40, 50 years, right, kind of train very carefully in how I listen to mystical experience and how I interpret it. And by the way, the same thing's true, right? There's 2 great domains which we've lost our ability to access. One is mysticism, right? Deep mystical experiences. 2 is deep erotic experience, right? And it's those 2 realms, which are unimaginably important, have become somewhat trivialized. And whether it's in the mystical or in the erotic, we don't easily distinguish between kind of pornographic mystical experience and genuine mystical experience, which is why it's very, very important not to build our story of value, right, on first-person realizations, because it's very, very hard to distinguish between qualities of realization. So we have to actually make 2 movements, right? right? David, correct. A whole week, a whole month, right? It's a whole month, right? It's actually it's a very, very deep process, right? To actually listen carefully, right? And actually discern between the voices, right? To discern between the voices. And let me try and say it this way, last sentence, right? Which is, on the one hand, we all need to become prophets. And I mean that very precisely. It's a major and an important theme, right? In other words, prophecy needs to be reclaimed, right? Prophecy is my capacity to access the interior face of cosmos, right? And a true artist has to be somewhat of a prophet, right? And to actually feel past, present, and future. Homo amor participates in some dimension of prophecy, right? Homo amor can feel some dimension of past, present, and future. Does that make sense, everyone? Can you feel what we're saying? On the one hand, right? On the other hand, right, we need to be enormously rigorous, right, in training, right? I train for prophecy, right? I cultivate, right, that particular eye of the spirit, that eye of prophecy, and I listen very deeply in order to be able to distinguish and to actually, I mean, if I can give you a phrase, to disambiguate the God voice. Does everyone get that? To disambiguate the God voice. Does everyone get that? So I want to give you an example, and then I'm going to get to our code. Okay. Who's with us? Who's with us? Okay. And this is, it's beautiful just to have sometimes these intimate days in one mountain to kind of just be in this together. You need a school of prophecy, and I need to learn to disambiguate the God voice. So let me just give you an example. So the story of Abraham, right, in chapter 22 of the book of Genesis, where Abram hears the God voice, right? And the God voice says to Abraham, right? God speaks to Abraham. Elohim nisat Abraham, right? Elohim, the voice Elohim, the God voice, speaks to Abraham and seems to say, Kachnet binchet yichidcha asher ahavta, to take your son, your only son, the son that you love, v'ha'aleu sham la'olah, and offer him up there as an offering. So I don't want to enter into this text now. It's a very, very important sacred text. But actually, that text was interpreted for generations. Kierkegaard wrote a book called Kierkegaard, the Danish theologian, the great early existentialist, right? Kierkegaard is, I think, one of the greatest heart minds, right, of his century, right? An unimaginable being. He wrote a very important book called Fear and Trembling about the binding of Isaac's story in chapter 22 in the book of Genesis. And he is the apotheosis, the ultimate expression of the classical reading of the story, in which, right, Abraham is so overwhelmed by the integrity of the God voice that he's willing to engage in what Kierkegaard calls the teleological suspension of the ethical. That's what Kierkegaard calls it. The teleological suspension of the ethical, right? Right. He's willing to actually bracket, right, that false voice, right, in some deep way. So now go slow with me, okay? Go slow. Stay close here. Kierkegaard was wrong, right? So let me get this straight. Kierkegaard says that the nature of the God voice is such that it brackets the ethical. Does everyone get that? It brackets the ethical. The teleological suspension of the ethical. The ethical is suspended, and Abraham goes to obey the God voice and sacrifice his son. And once God realizes he's willing to sacrifice his son, then the angel appears and says, Al tishlach na yadcha el hanar, don't stretch out your hand against the boy. Here's a lamb, offer the lamb instead. So I'm not going to go into a deep reading of this text now, but Kierkegaard's reading is the classical reading. Be willing to sacrifice your child because you so intensely recognize, right, the authenticity of the God voice, right? But actually, a deeper reading of that story, and one that, we articulate in a book called Tears that Benjamin's worked on and Talia's now completing. It is a book that I was privileged to write in 2006, right? But or 2005. I haven't read it since then, and we haven't published yet. We'll publish it, God willing. But basically, the way we read the story there is the way the actual Zohar read the story. Zohar, the Zohar, 13th century, the most authoritative book of interior sciences in the lineage of Solomon that shaped Luria, Isaac Luria, in the 16th century, who then shaped the Renaissance, the mystery schools of the Renaissance. And the Zohar, in elliptical words, you could read the Zohar and not realize it's there, but if you read it very carefully, the Zohar distinguishes between aspaklaria de meira, the clear prism, and aspaklaria de lo meira, de lo nahara, is the language in Aramaic, the unclear prism. And the Zohar claims elliptically that Abram is actually seeing through the unclear prism. And when the God voice speaks to Abraham, the Zohar says, Elohim, the God voice that speaks to Abraham, da yetzer hara. This is the evil inclination. So Abraham is unable to disambiguate the God voice. He hears the God voice saying, sacrifice your son. Right? And how many people hear a God voice saying, sacrifice your son? Right? You can't even begin to understand the tragedy of hearing that voice and identifying it with the God voice. But it wasn't the God voice. That's the point. And so Abraham actually has a father named Nimrod. He has a father, named Terach. His father's name is Terach, and Terach comes to bring his son Abram to Nimrod, who's the local deity god. And Terach, Abram's father, offers his son up in cruelty, right, to the deity king. So Abram himself has an experience of being abused by his father's religious ideals, and he has an experience of him being sacrificed to the deity God by his father. And that becomes internalized in Abraham in what might be called repetition compulsion, where Abraham then goes to sacrifice his son, and he identifies that voice of repetition compulsion as the God voice. Right? So it's big. So in other words, Abraham's challenge as a prophet was to disambiguate the voice and realize who's speaking, who's talking, who's talking. Is it God or is it the plumber? Right? Does everyone get that? In other words, Abraham has to be able to realize who's talking here. And the challenge of this penultimate story in the Western canon, in chapter 22 of the book of Genesis, is for Abraham to take responsibility for the God voice. Does everyone get that? Abraham has to take responsibility for the God voice. He has to take responsibility for his story. He has to disambiguate, but he has to be able to discern. It's like, wow. And it's so easy to confuse the voices of early trauma with the God voice. Right? Is that true, my friends? Is that true? Right? That's true. Okay. So it's why I'm so hesitant around first person. Right? And David's correct. We need a week, right? We need a week, right? In other words, first person realization is unimaginably important. First, I want to get that. Right? It's not true that the next Buddha is a Sangha, right? Which is so often quoted from Thich Nhat Hanh. There's no more Buddhas. Next Buddha is a Sangha. Not true, right? That's not true. The next Buddha is a Buddha and a Sangha, right? The Sangha needs to be a Buddha, right? And it's the community needs to be a unique self-symphony and move together as David J. Temple, right? Which is this pseudo-anonymous figure who represents both the particular writers and all of us as a community, as a unique self-symphony, right? The Marcello Ficino's, Florentine Platonic Academy in the Renaissance, right? An early version of this unique self symphony, absolutely, right? We are an intimate communion, but at the same time, we honor the Buddha, right? We honor first person realization. We honor, and Barbara and I used to have this kind of, teasing where, where Barbara would say to everyone, right, everyone can create their own Dharma. And I'd say, Barbara, if we say that one more time, we can't teach together. and we got it together. We went deeply into this together because, of course, and we, of course, aligned on it. Right? You can't just proclaim a Dharma. You have to kill yourself for a Dharma, right? You have to kill yourself to be a great artist. You have to kill yourself to do, right, physics the way they really need to be done. You have to kill yourself, right, to be Tolstoy, right? And Tolstoy is a bad example, right, for lots of reasons. But the point is, but you do have to kill yourself to be Tolstoy, right? And to be, right, and down the list, right? In other words, it's so deep, right? It's so deep, right? It's so deep. It's so deep, so deep, so deep, so deep, right? Right? It's so deep, right? In other words, I have to train the God voice in such a deep way, right? And step in to this clarified self. Now, how do I do that? Right? How do I do that? So that's a big question, right? I mean, that's a big question, how I do that. What is the methodology of clarification? And we'll spend an entire one mountain on how I do that clarification. Okay? We want to talk about that, but I just wanted to kind of further clarify this first person, right? In other words, the entire point, right, of the Binding of Isaac story is that Abraham is hearing a voice. That voice is understood by Kierkegaard, right, to be a trustable voice. And actually, what the Zohar, what the lineage of Solomon says is that Abraham is challenged to disambiguate, right, that voice from his own repetition compulsion, from his own early trauma. Wow. That's what it means to become a prophet. So, okay, so that's part two. That's part two. Okay, good. We got part two? That's part two. Okay, so now we get to start one mountain. Everyone ready? Are we ready to start? Okay, good. Here we go. Here we go. Are we ready? Who's ready? Who's ready? We're gonna take one step down. We're gonna take one step. So let's go to David's code. Okay, I want to go back to David's code here that he read, and I want to go to the second part of the code. And what I would like, with everyone's permission, is I want to spend the next 3-4 weeks kind of deep in this story, right? Conversation. So the code reads, the universe is not a fact. And maybe we could read it together wherever we are. The universe is not a fact. It's in the chat box, if you can see it there. The universe is not a fact. It's a story. It's not an ordinary story, but a love story. It's not an ordinary love story, but an evolutionary love story, right? An outrageous love story. And your story, my story, is chapter and verse in the universe : a love story. Okay, good. So that's good. Let me just add perhaps one thing here. Let me take a look. What we send out this week, right? So we sent out this week, and maybe we could kind of, read it together. I'll read it to you. We said this week, there's a famous, American poet, right, that says reality is not made up of atoms, reality is made up of stories, right? But actually, our response to that poet, to Muriel, is actually atoms themselves are stories, right? The very structure of an atom is a story. It's a particular story of allurement. It's a story of reaching for value. And we said that this Sunday, we're going to explore stories in the world of matter, atoms, right? We're going to explore stories in the world of life, and we're going to explore stories in the world of the self-reflective human. And we're going to talk about the evolution of story. So we're going to do that next week. We're going to get there. And I want to stay really close in this story idea. What I'd like to start with this week, though, is one dimension, which is, and in some sense, we're going to reverse the order, if that's okay, which is, once you realize that reality is a story, and we're going to go deep into that next week, this realization that reality is a story at its core structure, that everything is a story, I call it the ontology of story, right? The lineage would call it God loves stories, right? But in other words, that reality is structurally a story all the way down and all the way up the evolutionary chain. That story is not merely a story, right? It's not a human contrivance. That story is the essential structure of reality itself, right? And language is the the ritual of storytelling. That's what language is. Language allows us to tell stories. That's what language does. Language takes sound and turns them into meaning because meaning is already there, right? Language is this self-organizing code, right? Right, the self-organizing code, Lena, we said in a conversation once, I think a couple of weeks ago, which tells stories. But I want to talk not about that this week. I want to talk about, as we start one mountain, and we're going to be short now, but I want to see if we can get that. Okay. We'll see if we want to get that. Okay. I don't want to go into story now, and I don't want to go into language. I'm going to go into one dimension, which is that if you understand that your life is a story, okay, if you understand that your life is a story, you realize that you have to perform the story, that you're an actor on the stage. Okay. And for you Shakespeareans, I actually didn't have a chance to, I don't remember in this moment for some reason, I don't know, it exited my mind. So maybe someone will fill it in for me, where Shakespeare says all the world's a stage, and if that's exactly what he said or what he meant when he said it. So I'm not going to cite that because who knows what he was saying? I don't remember. But all the world is a stage, right? But and what we mean by that is that the world is a story, and my life's a story, and a story has to be performed. So I want to, if you can, we can just kind of open our hearts. I want to go deep into this for a second, because performance is unbelievably important, and we've lost our capacity to perform. And we can only respond to the meta crisis with what I would call a performance of our humanity. We have to perform our story. This is now part 3 today. We have to perform our story. We have to perform our humanity. We have to perform evolution. We have to perform our sexing, right? We have to perform our sacred autobiography. So let me see if we can kind of capture this, okay? See if I can capture this, right? And it's gorgeous. So there's a level of pre-tragic humanity, okay, in which there's an automatic understanding of the need to perform. And that understanding actually begins even in the animal world, right? Animals have mating rituals, right? The Brower bird does an incredible dance. And then, the animal sexes. The sexing itself in the animal world is generally short, a few seconds, but there's a performance that often leads up to the allurement and the mating ritual. This notion of ritual, though, takes a momentous leap forward in the human world. And as we enter into the human world, the need for ritual in its performance becomes central to the human experience. And there are those who date the emergence of Homo sapien with the emergence of trade. Matt Ridley talks about that quite extensively, citing many anthropologists. But there's another anthropological school, which I think is in part more accurate, although they're obviously, mutually supportive in certain ways, which actually dates the emergence of humanity with both language and art. Right? Language and art, or performed rituals, right? Artistically performed rituals, moving from paintings to religious rituals. Now you have the beginnings, you have proto experiences of, stay close, friends. You have proto experiences of religion in the animal world. The animal world already has proto experiences, early experiences of awe. And that's in the literature, of animal research in the last 15 years is disclosing this, but actually already in the lineage, I mentioned last week, there's a book called The Book of Song, Perek Shirah, which talks about the unique verse right, of awe expressed by every animal. But it becomes central and apparent, right? And it takes this momentous leap forward in some way in the human world. There's some emergence in the human world that's very dramatic, in which we perform. And we perform at the pre-tragic level. Everyone with me? And at the pre-tragic level, we perform. When I say it's pre-tragic, the pre-tragic level means everything's obvious and clear. So we perform. Why do we perform? Because there's gods and goddesses. Does everyone get that? There's gods and goddesses, right? There's the hills are alive with the sound of music. If we can jump forward, to a song and the sound of music in the mid 20th century, but it's the hills are alive with the sound of music is the experience of the pre-tragic world. The hills are alive. I do believe in fairies. I do, right? The Celtic sensibility of a kind of living universe is self-evident across the traditions, right? Everything's alive. There's a coherent field, and there's this interaction and relationship, however that relationship works between the human world and the broader field. And so we perform, right? The stage is obvious, and maybe we're performing for the gods and goddesses. Maybe we're performing for the one God. Right? That's not our conversation now. But performance makes sense. Ritual makes sense. And I'm not performing to be inauthentic. Does everyone get that? Right? I'm not performing to be inauthentic. I'm performing to make contact, to connect with the wider field, right? Whether it's to propitiate the deity, to ask favor, whether it's to locate myself in the wider field, right? Whether it's to feel the eros of the wider field, whether it's to give praise, whether it's to offer sacrifice, right? I'm performing. I'm in ritual, right? I understand performance. It's a natural place to be. I make contact with the wider field through my performance. Then what happens is, at some point, as we go through, right, all the stages of human development, we get to the modern world and the postmodern world, in which the world becomes disenchanted. We forget that the hills are alive. The world gets reduced to a kind of materialism. Descartes can no longer hear the sound of music living in the animal. But more than that, we have a kind of dualism, from the 17th century to the 19th century, which says, yeah, God's over there someplace, but the universe is purely material. And God might enter and act in the world, suggested the dualists. Then 2 centuries later in the 19th century, the materialists said, yeah, the dualists got one half right, the material part, and the God thing they were making up. So they lopped off the top half of the circle. So you have a circle where the top is God and the bottom is material. That was dualism. The materialists of the 19th century followed the dualists of the 17th century. They lopped off the top half of the circle, and they said, we live in flatland. Does everyone get that? We live in flatland. It's a flat world. It's a world ultimately without depth, right? Without the depth and dimension, right, that you would need, right, to actually access, right, the hills being alive with the sound of music. That's the tragic level. And at that tragic level, what we say is stop performing. Does everyone get that? The word performance itself becomes almost pejorative. Does everyone get what I'm saying? Well, like, why are you performing? Just get real, right? Just stop performing. And just be authentic. But authentic means why you're performing, because there's nothing to perform. I mean, there's no one to perform for. There's nothing that you're actually eliciting, right? So you're actually posturing, right? And you're posturing, and the word posture and imposture are etymologically related, right? There's and there's certainly, I didn't look up the etymology. That's a guess, but we'll have to look up the etymology. But imposture and posturing, my guess is that they're etymologically related, but they're certainly associated in their inner meaning, right? The impostor postures. Does everyone get that? The impostor postures. So what are you doing? Right. And Lane, that's exactly right. Just, stop it. Just get real. Right. And there was an entire movement, right, both in philosophy, right, in art, which said just get spare and simple. Right. There's nothing out there. Right. Just stop it. Stop the performance. And that's tragic. Right. There's this tragic moment. There's nothing to perform. Right. Don't perform your sexuality, just have sex, right? Don't perform your life, just live your life, right? And on the one hand, there's a rejection of the inauthentic artifice of performance, which is positive. But on the other hand, there's a rejection that there's anything to perform at all. Does everyone get that? That's the tragic level, which rejects performance. There's nothing to perform. And then we go to the post-tragic and we reclaim performance. We reclaim performance. In other words, I begin to realize, oh, there is a field of eros value, right? There is, right, a cosmos that's a living universe. There is a second person, right? Actually, right, there's an infinite intimate in which everything arises, right? And the field of the divine is not merely the infinity of power, as we've said many times, but the infinity of intimacy. So there's a second person relation. And there's this, how we started today, there's this first person that dances in me that wants to emerge. And as we said today, I've got to cultivate the emergence of first person, right? It's not obvious. I need to disambiguate between the authentic God voice and the inauthentic God voice. And I've got to perform my prophecy, and I've got to learn my lines, right? There's actually lines in the universe. There's actually a script that's mine. I'm actually a unique letter, a unique script in the cosmic scroll, and there's lines that are left by eternity for me to read and for me to evolve. And those lines are both already a given and they're emerging, right? And they're contingent, right? And they're radically surprising. But the kind of the general invitation of my life and its scripts was intended by reality. And reality intended me, and reality chose me to play that part. And reality recognizes me as the primary actor in that dimension of cosmos. And reality needs my script. And reality desires my performance. And reality love adores my performance. Right? So there's something to perform. In the post-tragic, we recognize that in the field of eros value, right, we are actually the storytellers. There's actually a story here. There's a story to be told. Reality is not merely a fact to be described mechanically. Reality is filled with the sound of music, and it's the melody of story. And story has to be performed. Story is art. And we go to movies because we're in love with story, right? I have to perform my sacred autobiography, right? And I begin, for example, take sexing. I begin to realize that sexing is not a mechanical act in the world of the tragic, but sexing is cosmic eros performed in the flesh. Does everyone get that? Sexing is cosmic eros performed in the flesh, right? And when I'm engaged in sexing, or when I'm engaged in realizing that evolution moves in me in person, right? Conscious evolution, the realization that I am the performance of evolution. That's what conscious evolution means. Conscious evolution means that I awaken to the realization that the evolutionary impulse moves uniquely in me. And I both realize that evolutionary impulse moves in my first person, but I'm also able to kind of watch and see, oh, that's me performing. So when the witness to my performance, second person, and my performance, first person, merge into one, that's the greatest performance, right? In other words, when the musician becomes the music, that's the ultimate performance, right? When the artist loses himself or herself, right? And she begins to paint through her or him, or to write through her or him, or to sex through her or him, or to talk through her or him, or to organize majestically, right? And artistically, right? The Vishnu function in Hindu mysticism, to organize, to weave the strands together, right? And she's moving through me, right? And when my witness and my first person synergize as one, that's the ultimate performance. I went to, with Christina, we took Zion. It was a father-son trip, but Kiki came with us and took care of us, right? So it was this trip, right? And we went to Circus Olay, to the circus. And for some reason, I think I got nauseous or KK got nauseous or Zion, and I don't know exactly what happened, but somehow we had these cheap seats, right? And somehow we wound up like just about in the first row, and kind of we were in the mezzanine. Then we wound up kind of in the like right next to the stage, and it was this. We were like for 1 hour, the last hour, we were riveted, right? You've got this group of kids. I mean, they must have been 18, 19, 20, 25, and they're performing. They're performing their bodies, right? They're performing motion itself. They're performing movement. They're performing, right, the musical play. They're performing, right, the synchronies of coordination that are shocking and dazzling, right, in their beauty. And as they performed, they became more themselves than they ever were. It wasn't a performance that was inauthentic. It was a performance that disclosed, right, their ultimate realization in first person, right? It performance potentiated, right, or realized the potentiation of their fullness. That's what practice is, right? And it's I perform in order to become myself, right? So I don't just make love personally, right? Because part of the realization of the story is when I perform the story, part of the realization is that my story is not separate from the universe, a love story. So there's no split in the story between the personal and the cosmic, right, Danette? And until I realize that every detail of my story, right, is until I realize there's no detail of my story that's disconnected from cosmic magnificence, my mind can never feel any sense of ease, right? Until the story of my life is told. Laura Riding wrote this next line. Until the story of my life is told, I will go on quietly craving it. But Laura Riding just got a piece of it. No, until the story of my life is told, and I realize that my story is part of the story of cosmos. The cosmos is a story, and I'm a chapter in that story, and I'm a necessary, right, chapter in my story. We talk a lot about, kind of the meaning of life, right? So we should talk less about the meaning of life, right? Right? There is, in a certain sense, it's not that life, right? We search for the meaning of life. You don't have to search for the meaning of life, right? You don't have to search for the meaning of life because life is meaning. Life is meaning. And meaning always discloses itself in story, right? A value is a desire I have for realization, right, in the course of a story. So the universe is story. The universe is semantic, right? And the universe is made up of stories. And stories have grammar. So there's a story of value, and the story has a grammar of value, right? And our chromosomes themselves are tomes, right? Right? Our atoms are already, right, encyclopedias, right? But they're not just encyclopedias of facts. They're great encyclopedias, which are great biographies telling stories of movements of allurement, right? Moving towards ever deeper contact and ever larger wholes, right? So it's not that we have to search for meaning. Do you get that? There's no search for meaning. There's nothing to search for. We are meaning, right? We articulate meaning in every breath, right? And all of our stories, right, have plot lines, right? And our story, our individual saga, right, is not separate or distinct from, right, the magnificent and sprawling saga of the universe. Right? And all of it is performed. Does everyone get that? So to know that my life is a story is to know, we'll go back to the code, to know that the story must be performed. And there's 3 levels of relationship to performance, right? Right? And particularly to the performance of our story. Level 1 is pre-tragic performance. It's clear, we perform. We're in some version of pre-modern performance in our tradition. Gorgeous, right? It's fantastic. And then we get to this tragic place of postmodernity where we stop performing. And we actually view performance becomes a pejorative word. It becomes identical with the inauthentic, with the not real. And then we go to the post-tragic and we realize, no, we perform to elicit the real. At Circus LA, they were performing to elicit the real, right? When we do ritual practice, we do enlightenment practice, We perform to elicit the real. Right? When I perform, when I'm reading my lines, and they're the lines of my unique sacred autobiography that can only be spoken by me, that all of reality and all of eternity and all of evolution waited for me to speak, right? Then I become me. And I become me because I now become, right, the primary actor in the story. So we realize reality is a story, number one. Number two, we realize that it's not an ordinary story, it's a love story. It's a story of eros, it's a story of allurement. Number three, we realize that our stories, our personal stories, are chapter and verse in this great story. Number four, we realize we're the storytellers of the whole story. That's what conscious evolution means. We're not just the storytellers of our story. We have to be the storytellers of the whole story. Conscious evolution means two things. One, we begin to see the storyline. We begin to see the storyline. We begin to see, oh, wow, right? There's a movement from matter to life to mind, and there's a plot line, right? There's a set of first principles and first values that are emerging and developing in this large, there's discontinuities, but there's also this long continuities, right? This evolution of these first principles and first values through matter, life, and mind. That's the first part of conscious evolution. I realize there's a story. Does everyone get that? We didn't say that before. I realize there's a story. I see the sweep of the universe story. And then part five, so I become the storyteller of the universe. That's four. Part five, I realize my story, right? You're right. I'm an actor in the story. My story, I'm an actor in the story. 5, 6. And that my story is a chapter in this larger story. There's no split between the personal and the cosmic, right? And in early feminism, they said the personal is the political. We now realize, no, the personal is the polis of the cosmos. The personal is the cosmic, right? Number 6 and number 7, we realize that the entire story is unfinished. It's an unfinished story. And then I participate in telling, in taking the story forward and evolving the story. It's not just that my story is part of my, as unique self, my story is a unique chapter in the story, but number 7, my story evolves the story. It's an unfinished story, and my story evolves the story. Right? Wow. And finally, number 8, last one. When we meet someone and we have this, profound new relationship with them, which is unusual, and we say, wow, we always knew each other. Right? That rare moment, we say those rare meetings, well, we always knew each other. And we realize that we're each holding a piece of each other's story. Right? In a genuine, unique self-encounter, we each realize we're each holding a piece of each other's story, and we can only complete each other's story with each other. Right? We need each other. Right? No one's holding the whole story. Our stories evoke each other. We each evoke each other's story, but more than that, right? We each have a piece of each other's story that we can return to that person. In a genuine, but a real unique self-encounter, I realize you have a piece of my story that you're returning to me. And by you living your story, these are two distinct points. I can live my story. We create the possibility of each living our unique stories that are inter-included and overlapping. 1, 2, we evoke each other's story. Right? When you're living your story, you evoke my story. Your authenticity evokes my authenticity. Your performance of your story evokes my performance of my story. And then 3, in this last point, there's 3 points in 8. 3 is you're actually holding a piece of my story that you can return to me. Right? You recognize a piece of my story in a way I don't. And you're holding that piece for me and you return it to me. That's what it means to love each other madly. Okay, wow. Right? Wow. Wow. So let's perform our stories. We have to perform our authenticity. Right? I mean, let me end with something silly. Right? Put on a nice shirt, even when you're at home by yourself. Right? Whatever that means to you. Maybe that's not the way you perform. But however you perform, you've got to always be doing ritual. You can't just say it. You can't just think it. You have to perform it. Right? I perform my unique self. Right? I perform my unique story. It's dramatic. Right? Chogyam Trungpa, who kind of founded Naropa, an Eastern master in a particular lineage who founded Naropa University. He was a wildly realized master who was also kind of drunk most of the time, and pretty much slept with every student in Europa. It was the early 70s and crazy stuff was happening. And so he was both a realized master and in this space between generations, which was a different space. It wasn't the space of today, right? So he was a kind of a crazy wisdom master, right? Not to be imitated, right? In any way, to be clear. But he would always perform. So literally all the time, he would have, he would always, literally, they would, he'd be the captain, or he'd be the general, or he'd be the king, and people would have positions in the court, and they'd perform all the time, right? And people were like, what is he doing? And still today, they think, what crazy thing was he doing? Right. But actually, from his heart to my heart, right? It's like from my heart to your heart, our hearts together, we perform. One mountain has to be a performance, but not inauthentic, right? And in other words, right, all great art is performance, and life is great art, right? Life's great art, and it requires performance, right? We're always on, right? We're always on. It's the most beautiful thing in the world. Even when we're relaxing, we're totally spatially relaxing. We're actually, right? We're witnessed, right? Our story is fabricating, right, the world story.